A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back once again to HJN. This is, without a doubt, where I plan on ending HJN Super Graphix. As you probably know by now, this is what I consider to be a sequel to HJN Graphix, which came out in 2021. But here in 2025, I not only continued this, but I feel like I've arguably done even better in this series, in contrast to the original. So, for the final entry in this series, number 2633, is going to be all about yet another 2023 title, Aliens Dark Descent. So, let's get on with it, shall we? This was, of course, unlike with any of the other Alien games that we had so far. In more recent years, there was 2014's Alien Isolation, which I had talked about, as a first-person survival horror game in which that you defend against the one xenomorph alien that's all around on the Sevastopol station. Then there was Aliens Fireteam Elite, in which you play as a group of Marines that are out and about to search for some clues and answers to a supposed conspiracy that took place. But in Aliens Dark Descent, which came out 2 years later, almost by surprise, as I hardly ever expected yet another Alien game to come around, but hey, summer 2023, less than 2 years after Fireteam Elite came around, I was more than interested in the usage of a title like this. A title that actually is, get this, different than the other two. And it's mainly because of the perspective / playing style that we had seen. In Isolation, it was first-person survival horror. In Fireteam Elite, it was third-person. It was mostly an action-adventure shooter type of game. But in Dark Descent, it's an overhead view in which that you navigate through with an overhead perspective, sort of like with most helicopters and drones, in which that you navigate a group of Marines. This group of Marines, of course, is led by a person known as Hayes. And Hayes, she's basically what we come to know as the person in charge of the Marines and the handling of a certain operation that's going on planet Leith. And unlike with most of the other alien-related media here, Leith is, of course, overrun not only by aliens, but by a series of different things. You have cultists whom are more than willing to fight against the Marines as a supposed means to try to preserve their own culture. Then, of course, you have a variety of different other enemies to face up against as well. And while the xenomorphs happen to be the biggest, most common enemy that you face throughout Dark Descent, it goes without saying that there are truly a number of different things you got to be on the lookout for. Because while you are in an overhead perspective, thereby making things a bit easier to work with, sometimes that doesn't always add up to the ease of controlling the characters and or making the good decisions necessary to allow for their survival. Anyways though, the story basically kicks us off with Hayes basically making it out alive, as the game does give you the clear-sighted instructions necessary for Hayes' survival. It's morely about stealth in a way that allows Hayes for her to make her way out of the station that she's currently in, and then eventually find solace alongside the Marines as well as other members in a local settlement. This settlement is taking place at a station that is hovering above planet Leith, and when all is said and done, they basically try to work some things out. The thing is that Hayes' new HQ, if you will, happens to be full of different resources. You have engineering stations, you have a medical bay, as well as a recovery room made for mental and physical rehabilitation for the ones that are not so fortunate out there and are possibly traumatized. Then, of course, you have yourself a command room, which does allow for her to not only have interactions with some of the higher members of the Marines, but also to allow for her to initiate certain missions. She is able to deploy any soldiers and resources to the planet Leith and otherwise, in order to, in fact, make her way through from point A to point B. And on top of all that, this whole thing that's going on with the aliens and with yet another big story's worth of conspiracies and a large plan for annihilation, it really does compact together into one uniform adventure that for 2023 might not have seemed all too interesting, but the fact is, it actually grew to a point where I myself was able to play through from start to almost finish. Let me explain. Like I've said, while Hayes was able to get out of a certain station almost alive after going through some crap out there with the Xenomorphs practically invading and wiping out the entire station's worth of colony members, she was able to make her way out of there and group up with the Marines. These Marines, of course, would fall under her command as she was basically assigned to be in charge of these Marines. And the Marines in question are, in fact, very different from what we've seen in Fireteam Elite. Unlike with the last game, this is morely focused on Hayes' own perspective, basically her own control. As in, what does she want in the colony that she's working with now, and with the Marines that she has to take care of now? Well, the thing is that us players basically allow for Hayes to move to the different segments of the building. You have the science lab, you have the workshop, you have the command room, you have the medical bay, and otherwise. And then, of course, there is a special spot for all the soldiers to do some training as well as some recovery. So that way, they can be well equipped and prepared for the next fight on Planet Leith. In terms of my overall gaming experience, I was able to make a pretty good 13.5 hours worth of gameplay, until eventually I got to the point where there was a pretty long mission that didn't really have any checkpoints or reset spots. I would have had to go all the way back up to the station and redeploy from there. There's basically little to no ways and the means of save points or checkpoints that would have allowed for me to continue from that point on and simply go further down underground and fight more of the Xenos. But the thing is that all that we've gotten up to this point was a large group of survivors, now turned dead. Yeah, the thing is though, is that up until this very point, all the things that I basically were able to accomplish here within a good 13.5 hours worth of time spent on the game entirely was from a various different series of functions. A lot of different choices that I made over the course of the game entirely, based on the story that was driven from point A to point B, did include a lot of cutscenes, many of which were interactions between Hayes and the many other members of the colony that she was working with, including a hired member of the Marines who unfortunately becomes so stressed that he has to be taken to the medical room at some point. Yeah. And speaking of which, this is basically one major aspect that we got to realize here. When we're working with a group of up to 4 Marines at a time, regardless of who they are, where they came from, what they specialize in, what their weapons they're carrying, what skills they have, the thing is that we do have the option to situate these different soldiers with different weapons that we get, especially if they come from certain locations on Planet Leith that we go through. Based on work with the likes of both the science lab and the workshop, we're able to manufacture and produce different things to allow for these soldiers to make their jobs a lot easier, and probably for the better to work with. We have different guns, of course, including automatic weapons, submachine guns, handguns, cannons, flamethrowers, and RPGs, sniper rifles, and whatnot. Then, of course, there comes special attacks, which will include other weapons that they own, like the shotgun or the grenade launchers, or sometimes other things as well. And speaking of the specials, there's not only the likes of a certain heavy weapon that does allow for us to have the option to blast away the Xenos in any consecutive way, but then there's also other commands, including suppressing fire, as well as the unique way to position. The thing is that one of the most common commands is when you're navigating through the entire map's worth of networks, which includes the lands, the buildings, and whatnot. Being that we're in an overhead perspective, we can see the buildings a lot more clearly and also the interior. So you might think that we have an advantage here in order to find rooms with xenomorphs and likely sneak past them rather than fight them, but that's unfortunately not always the case. Sometimes the rooms are just dark and we have to have the Marines explore the rooms just to find out what's inside. And I feel like that's one weakness that sort of makes the game a bit less intangible here, but on the other hand, it's always good to have a bit of mystery here. What could be inside those rooms that are just flat out blacked out? Well, the thing is that all these different rooms that we go through and all these different buildings that we work with, regardless of the mission in hand, as there are a good handful of different locations that we encounter, various compounds, scientific buildings, facilities, loading bays, garages, and enormous manufacturing depots, including factories. There's a good variety of different locations that we get to work with throughout the entire time span that the game helps us work with. And from what it allowed us to work with up until the very point where I myself unfortunately had to just move on. I will say that I was able to get a good amount of progress into it and also have a lot of pre-planning as well as all the experience necessary to eventually allow me to acclimate to the game's overall difficulty and the sheer aura that's allowed for it to basically be quite the challenge. One that's quite different than what I've anticipated. And it has allowed me to unfortunately die a few different times. But hey, after some adjustments and after some learning from my own mistakes, it actually got a lot easier as time went on. But that's not to say that everything about the game is easy. It's certainly no cakewalk when you think about it. The more of the game that you play, the higher the threats of the aliens will come around. It eventually builds up to quite a big point in which we not only have to grab a hold of bigger weapons, but also bigger equipment. Remember those mechs? Yeah, the Power Loader 5000s. Those things do make quite an appearance in Aliens Dark Descent. But the main objective within that sort of usage is that using the power loader does allow for one Marine to take a hold of this unique equipment and allow for certain heavy objects to be moved around. But the main disadvantage of that is it acts like an escort mission that runs pretty slow. Well, because the power loader unfortunately doesn't quite move as fast as the other guys do, so that's probably another bit of a drawback here I might as well address. The sort of escort mission field that we have when we're operating the power loaders is sort of a big of a drag. But on the other hand, it does allow for some challenge to be put together here. Of course, as I've said before, we do have all these resources to work with and all these different places to go within the colony that we have up in the station, where Hayes basically gets to not only meet up with certain faces whom are responsible for running operations in places like the workshop, the armory, the medical bay, science lab, etc. But all these different people that we get to see, unfortunately, do end up suffering from some hardships. Because, especially after that little thing with the power loader goes on, and everybody's back up in order on the station, there unfortunately becomes a bit of a problem. The scientist running the science lab, unfortunately, ends up prey to the xenomorphs. We're once again left with Hayes, an unarmed person whom has to sneak around the station fighting for her own life. She doesn't even get a chance to arm herself with any nearby weapons, and it's not like any of the Marines that we got are basically there to help out. Yeah, so it's at this point in time where the station's not only run over in a pretty bad way, but it also gets to the point where, get this, a certain amount of time is put together where the planet will be literally wiped out. Yeah, we're given about a month's worth of time here. And it's insane when you think about it. But hey, all these different challenges and hardships that these characters had to go through just makes us more than determined to want to beat the game entirely. Like I said though, when I got to the underground segments, that's where I had to drop the line and pretty much the game entirely, allowing for me to basically just move on with it. Especially having died 3 different times and basically spending about 35 straight minutes going through certain caverns and exploring the underground areas in particular that are supposed to lead to what is supposedly the final battle, especially with the Queen alien from what I've understood. Being that we've already fought a few Queens up until this point, it doesn't seem all that original. But I don't really know. This is definitely one of those games that has certainly had a lot to do with adjustments to the lore from all the other Alien films and other Alien media that we got so far, but at the same time inventing its own storyline and having its own original line of characters. But much like Fireteam Elite, having control over the Marines does allow for some unique action and adventure sequences, the likes of which that we have had done so, mainly because of the movies. Aliens certainly did bring about the idea of Marines fighting against the Xenomorphs and proving that there is a way to fight back. And it really has opened the door. Combating against aliens really has been more than just a simple trend. Think about all the other franchises that have done something like that. Men in Black, Independence Day, American Dad, My Favorite Martian, Paul, or who could even forget? E.T. Even though that wasn't really necessary. But still, the idea of people versus aliens has been more than a common trend, even to this very day. I almost do wonder though, is it ever going to be any bigger or any better by this point? Who really knows? But anyways though, regardless of what we got here, with the likes of Focus Entertainment being the one who published this game, whereas the others were done so by different companies. It's safe to say that because of the fact that this game itself has been a bit different than the others, some people might argue with it probably not being as good as the other two, but I'd say it probably does better, mostly for the fact that the sheer functionality of it is a little more easier to adjust to, believe it or not. In comparison with just simply working with first-person or third-person perspectives, this overhead perspective, much like some other games I've played over the years, actually gives me a full idea of what I'm working with here. That way, there's little to no cryptics involved, and better, it gets easier to navigate as you go on. Because adjustments, while they might take time in certain ways, having an overhead view with all the possible vision that you might need for all the characters to work with helps to make it much better to work with. And even more so is the fact that the storyline was able to smoothly carry on with minimal deaths. Unless, of course, if it got too challenging. That was probably one of the biggest reasons why I've died many times over. But in the end, I feel like that it's all worked out to a pretty unique title. And Focus has definitely done some good games over the years. Remember certain other masterpieces that we had gotten, and ones that probably weren't as good as most others, but still, Focus definitely does have itself a solid reputation. And I sure do hope that anything else they might work with, they could probably do even better. But at the end of the day, Aliens Dark Descent probably does better than the other games. Almost on par, if not better than Alien Isolation, but certainly a lot better than Fireteam Elite. Because even there, it was a bit difficult for me to work with. And while Isolation also had itself a bit of a difficult factor in terms of navigation, we at least had a map system to work with. All three of the games had maps to work with, to help make it feel a little less cryptic. But Dark Descent practically acted like a map on its own without me needing to open up a map, more than half the time at least. So at the end of the day, with easy navigation, coupled up with many different places to visit, a lot of resources to gather, a lot of stuff worth collecting, treasure chests to open, rooms to explore, buildings and all sorts to navigate through, and basically gun down every enemy impossible, whether it be human characters or xenomorphs or otherwise, Aliens Dark Descent probably is one of the best Alien games I might have played. Period. And it plus Isolation truly do make for such a unique duo over the past 10 years. So with that in mind, Aliens Dark Descent will get itself a good 8.7 out of 10.1. And I feel like that is more than satisfying by my own account. So, of course, this is pretty much it. I'm certainly going to be taking a bit of a break from all this because I have made lots of HJN episodes and I feel like that overdoing it might not be a great thing. So that's why I'm going to be taking a bit of a break after this. And I will see you guys later on in March 2025, in which I will in fact continue forward with more regular HJN programming, just as usual. So, if you want to see more come down on my channel, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side.